All right, with that, we can go get started. Today, we're joined by three panelists to talk about fellowship opportunities in science policy. We've got Eric, Melody, and Grant, who I'll be giving a bit longer of an introduction for later. But kind of before getting started, I know, especially for the folks who are coming from Berkeley, as well as maybe others from all over the country, want to kind of give a brief introduction about who the science policy group is, Berkeley is specifically, and talk a little more broadly about what we mean when we're talking about fellowship opportunities in science policy, kind of set the stage to hear a little bit more detail from each of our panelists following that. So the way this is going to be structured, just as an FYI, we'll have a brief introduction followed by each panelist will give their remarks and maybe give some introduction to their particular fellowship opportunity and experience. And then follow that, we'll start going into a panel Q&A followed by audience Q&A. So if you have questions you'd like to ask our panelists at any time, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll get to them towards the second half of today's event. With that, briefly about the science policy group at Berkeley, who is hosting this event. Again, for those of you who are at Berkeley and maybe this is the first time attending one of our events, we encourage you to come back. We've got another event next week and we're continually active, even remotely here on campus. But our broad mission is to really increase campus engagement with science policy issues. We offer a lot of professional development opportunities such as this. You'll hear from one of our alumni who has benefited from those professional development opportunities today. We really support students to advocate for evidence-based policy making broadly. So there's a wide range of interests in our group and we do our best to support those people. We more broadly, specifically advocate for issues related to STEM, and we serve as our campus's member organization of the National Science Policy Network, which actually all of our panelists today are also affiliated with. So hopefully you'll hear a little bit more about that as well. So if you're interested, you're welcome to join our mailing list. This is also open to non-Berkeley folks as well, in case you wanted to join and just stay up to date with what's going on. So talking specifically about science policy fellowships, we really want to highlight this as an opportunity to gain hands-on experience really working in government, specifically designed for folks with STEM backgrounds. As you can see here, this is just a brief sampling of some of the different programs. We've got representatives from 3 of the different programs with us today, but there's really a broad sampling of different programs, and I plug a list here in the bottom right. You can check it out. That was curated by Kelly Single, which has there's probably dozens, if not couple hundred different science policy fellowship opportunities that you can check out there if you're interested. Most require a PhD. Those others, might just require a master's or some level of experience in addition to kind of some STEM training. And they're available in the federal government, from professional societies, at the state level, from NGOs. You'll hear from a wide gamut of different experiences from folks today. And I also want to really highlight, this is science policy fellowships are one path into science policy, but they are not the only path. So definitely want to highlight that there are many folks who with STEM backgrounds who go into science policy without ever doing one of these, and that's also great opportunities there. We just happen to be focusing on this particular topic today. As I mentioned, these are most of the ones, especially the ones listed here, are all at the federal level. Science policy doesn't just happen in Washington, D.C., right? Science policy happens all across the country, and especially within recent years, there's been a whole slew of state level fellowships that have sprung up, and Melody can maybe talk about some of her work. She's been starting one in Texas as well, but you can kind of see here, there's a number of programs that are already active, and many are still soliciting applications right now in case, or will be in the coming year, in case you're interested, as well as a number of programs that are still in development, as you can see. So we also encourage you to talk about that. We have Grant here, who's did the CCST science, who is a CST science and technology policy fellow. She'll get to hear a bit of sampling of what that looks like as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our panel to get us started. First up, we're going to have Eric. So Eric graduated from UC Berkeley with a PhD in infectious diseases and immunity way back in 2019. Following that, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Engineering Biology Research Consortium, where he led a lot of different science policy initiatives related to microbiome engineering. He also previously served as the co-chair of the Western Hub of the National Science Policy Network, and is currently a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Executive Fellow at USAID, where he manages relationships with funding recipients, facilitates support for research programs, and supports the role of higher education institution in USAID's work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric to kind of give us a brief description of kind of your experience and any insight you want to offer to start us off.
Great, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so I feel like you touched on kind of the main arc of sort of my background that has led me to this point. But to highlight a few of those things, I started getting involved with science policy as a member of the science policy group at Berkeley. I want to say that I started getting involved in maybe around 2017 or 2018. And then after graduating, got a postdoc fellowship with EBRC, or the Engineering Biology Research Consortium. And that was, I think, for me, a great experience to learn more about science policy. And it served as sort of a transition between graduate school and starting my AAAS fellowship. And I kind of, want to reiterate what Chris had said in terms of there being opportunities for scientists to get involved with policy without doing a fellowship, because another postdoc who started that position with me is actually still at EBRC and is planning on staying there. So there are these opportunities out there. I mean, I think that the fellowships are just the most well-known, but there are definitely positions outside of a fellowship that take a little bit more searching, but will lead you to still working in science policy. So I think like right now I'm working at USAID as a AAAS fellow. I have interests in, I think it's been a really interesting experience, especially kind of doing it during a pandemic. I know that we had talked about maybe touching on this earlier, or later in the panel, Chris, but one thing that has been really interesting is just doing this fellowship while still living in Berkeley. I hope someday to see my desk. That's what I'm saying at this point. But I think one thing that has been a good takeaway is just recognizing how much I could still learn while working remotely, even if I don't get to live in DC for the fellowship. With that, I'll stop, Chris.
Great, thanks, Eric. So of course, as Eric mentioned, we'll have some more opportunities to dig a little deeper into some of what he's been doing, as well as ask more questions. So feel free to start dropping those in the chat at any time or for any of our speakers. With that, I will be transitioning over to Melody. So Melody is a PhD candidate in bioengineering at Rice University, soon to be graduated. As a graduate student, she founded both the Rice Science Policy Network and the Texas Science Policy Fellows Program. She currently leads the State Fellowships Committee of the National Science Policy Network. And in 2019, she served as a Christine Mirzayan Science and Technology Policy Fellow, supporting the National Cancer Policy Forum and the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And she will also be starting as an IEEE AAAS Congressional Fellow this fall. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Melody.
Thanks so much, Chris, and hi all. So like Chris mentioned, I was a Mirzayan Fellow in 2019 at the National Academies. And I always say that this was like the 3 happiest months of my life in recent memory. So I had been involved in science policy through Rice's Baker Institute for Public Policy prior to that. But the Mirzayan opportunity really accelerated my involvement in the policy space. And so to go into a little more detail about what that opportunity looks like. So the Mirzayan Fellowship is open to people who are currently in graduate school, which makes it a really, really unique opportunity. I actually did it only 2.5 years into my PhD. So there's around 20-ish fellows selected every year. And each of those fellows is placed with a board or committee at the National Academies. So I was with the Board of Healthcare Services. There's also boards and committees that deal with agriculture, law and justice, statistics, chemical sciences, earth sciences, astronomy, water, really just like the whole range of possible policy topic areas. And so you spend 12 weeks there. You're kind of embedded into a board and committee, just really learning like how the National Academies functions. It was an incredible learning opportunity. And additionally, you also have freedom to just run around DC and like experience what the policy world there is like. And I love that. I spent a lot of time networking, attending congressional hearings and briefings, and learned that I really love the policy space. And I especially really like the policy space where it intersects with politics, which led me to then later this year apply and receive a congressional fellowship. So in terms of what I did at the National Academies, so my board happened to have 2 in-person workshops during the time I was there. So I got to participate in just setting up those workshops and interfacing with all the stakeholders they brought in. So I got to talk to people from the FDA and cancer patient advocates and people representing hospitals, physicians, just really the whole range of people involved in caring for people with cancer. I can also go into a little more detail about just like the eligibility. So it's really open to current grad students as well as recent grads. There are no citizenship requirements, which makes it really unique. So people on student visas, including people with DACA, are completely eligible. And so this year, the timeline slightly adjusted. Normally it's January through April, but this year, because of COVID, it got shifted. So the deadline has not closed yet. It closes at the end of this month. So definitely encourage y'all to look into this opportunity. Always happy to talk more about it. And I will turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks, Melody. With that, we'll roll right along to our final panelist. So we have Grant. Grant graduated from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a PhD in chemistry in 2017. And then as a postdoc at University of Wisconsin-Madison, he served as the communications chair for their Catalysts for Science Policy group. He's also an associate editor for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance and is currently a CCST Science and Technology Policy Fellow placed with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control. With that, I'll let you take it away, Grant.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I, unlike Eric, am pretty new to California, so it's a nice honor to be here, and also a nice honor for me to be able to serve the people at California through my placement at the Department of Toxic Substances Control. And so just a little bit about me. I'm originally from the state of Hawaii, but I did all of my post-secondary education in the Midwest, hence going to Illinois and Wisconsin. I had originally, when I was a graduate student, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I had heard a talk by a alum of Illinois who was at that time a current fellow of the CCST program. And I remember hearing her talk and thinking, wow, that sounds really interesting. Thinks I might want to do that at some point. So I kept that in the back of my mind. And of course, in graduate school, I was sort of trying to find a job immediately out of after graduating. So I didn't apply to the fellowship right away. Decided to do a postdoc. And when I did a postdoc, I stumbled upon Catalysts for Science Policy, or CASP, which is also a chapter of the National Science Policy Network. Got heavily involved with the organization really early on, and found that this was a really fascinating area, and I really wanted to pursue that further. And so when time came, I decided it would be a good opportunity to apply for this fellowship. And I was fortunate enough to be accepted the fellowship and started last November with training, and started in my placement at DTSC in January of this year. And I'm happy to share a lot of my experiences, but I'll stop here for now.
Great, thanks so much, Grant. And yeah, thank you all for those introductions and kind of giving folks a sense of these different opportunities available in science policy fellowships. For those who tuned in a bit late, I dropped the link in the chat. That is a more exhaustive list of all the potential science and technology policy fellowships that are out there. And it also includes all of the ones that our panelists have already mentioned here as well. So you can be sure to check that out for more information. To kind of get us started with questions, and of course, attendees, please continue to drop questions in the chat, and we'll get to some of those in a little bit. Some of you have mentioned this briefly about the many accomplishments that y'all had in science policy, even as graduate students. But in particular, were there any things that, in addition to maybe elaborating a little bit more on some of those things that you did do during graduate school, were there any other things that you wish you had done now looking back with all your experience? Or there were things you wish you had done in graduate school that might have helped? And I don't know if anybody wants to take a first stab at that.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I did the Merzion fairly early into my graduate career, and also fairly early in my science policy involvement. So I didn't have as much science policy specific content to put on my resume at that point per se. But one thing that really helped me is I had gotten really involved in political organizing after the 2016 election. So I'd been involved in local, state, and federal campaigns. And just through those experiences, talked to like hundreds of voters in the Houston area, really understood how issues were framed, like what mattered to people. And of course, I just learned how to organize from scratch as an engineer. I had no background in political science or grassroots organizing at all. And so when I was applying for the Merzion, just being able to write and talk about that experience, I think really demonstrated that I cared about things outside the lab. I was really plugged into the community, really motivated by community needs. And then also that I was very comfortable and eager to learn in spaces that I was not necessarily trained in. So actually most of my Merzion fellowship application was about political organizing. But after I did the Merzion, one thing I learned was how important informational interviews are. And I don't think I even knew what an informational interview was prior to the Merzion. And for those who don't, it's basically when you just reach out to people in a space you're interested in working in, and you ask just for a quick call, maybe like 20, 30 minutes max, to just ask about their experiences, how they got there, what their day-to-day life looks like. And so once I became a Merzion, I realized that a lot of other Merzion applicants had done a lot of those info interviews prior to applying. And I just completely was not aware of that. But just learning that from Merzion really helped me the second time around for my congressional fellowship application, where I did a lot of informational interviews and I got really, really helpful advice from current and previous fellows.
I think one thing that I always like to recommend to people is just learning how to write for a non-academic audience. So one of the things that I did as a student at Berkeley was wrote a number of articles for the Berkeley Science Review. I think that one reason why that was really helpful for me is that there's a very particular way that you present information and data in a journal format. And what was nice about writing for the Science Review is that it's specifically tailored for a non-academic audience. And at the same time, you get assigned 1 or 2 editors for every article that you're writing. So that, for me, I think, if I had to pick a thing, that would be it, is just learn how to write for people outside of your field, outside of your discipline, because I think that's a really useful skill in policy.
Yeah, and I would agree with those comments shared by both Melody and Eric. I think for me, one thing I wish I had done more, because that was a question, I believe, was doing a little bit more of public outreach. I think I spent a lot of time in my silo, I guess, and sort of wish that I had did more outside of the lab. And I think one thing that I did do during my postdoc, which I really enjoyed, was I worked elections. I was a poll worker for multiple elections, and that was a very fun experience. And I think it's really for any fellowship, I think being able to demonstrate that you're committed to doing something along the lines of public service is very important. And being able to demonstrate that, I think, is very useful.
Excellent. Yes, and great plug for poll working, and also Eric for the Berkeley Science Review, who we've worked with a number of times here at SPG. So I'll also shamelessly plug that as well. I want to get into kind of working in some of the audience questions. There's a really good one specifically here where one of our someone's asked, what does an average day look like in science policy, if you can even describe what an average day looks like? And I know, recognizing that some of you have only ever worked remotely. So with all those caveats, could any of you maybe speak to maybe not only what does an average day look like, but what are some of the things or the projects that you're actively working on like right now or worked on during your fellowship that you could say, you would have worked on during a typical day? I don't know, Grant, maybe we can start with you on this one.
Sure. So average day, I think it's hard trying to extrapolate from a fellowship experience, because kind of by nature, fellowship is really designed to get you exposed to a lot of different things. And so you have, I think early on you get roped in, or not roped in, but invited into sitting in a lot of different meetings on various topics that you have no idea what anyone's talking about at the beginning, but you pick up fairly quickly. But I think once you get settled in, there are certain work products that might come along, or I guess various types of research that you could potentially get involved with, as well as just kind of doing some day-to-day type of tasks. I think for me, I currently within DTSC, I work in two different offices. One is the Office of Legislation and Regulatory Review, which is the legislative office, and so that office tracks a lot of legislation that goes through the California State Legislature. Our office communicates the aspects of legislation with our program staff. So if there's a bill that impacts a particular area within the department, we communicate with them to try to understand how this bill impacts them, what improvements could be made to the bill if possible, and so on and so forth. We also interact with legislative staff, provide technical assistance. And so that's sort of a little bit more of a, I guess, reactive space, because you're sort of reacting to a lot of what's happening in the legislature. My other office is the Safer Consumer Products program, and that's a core program within DTSC, which its mission is to is to make consumer products safe, and removing toxics from consumer products, and working with industry to find safer alternatives in the manufacturing of products. And in that area, I'm working on a very unique project, which is a little bit more of a kind of a policy research, kind of a high level, I guess, investigative type of work. And the goal is to write a white paper that kind of re-envisions chemicals and toxics management. And so with these two offices, my day kind of gets shifted around depending on what topic I need to focus on. Oftentimes it depends on what types of meetings I have in a particular day. Or like today, for example, this morning, I was the Environmental Safety and Toxic Materials Committee in the Legislature Assembly was having their hearings. So I was, tuning into that because they were discussing or they're hearing a few bills that I'm specifically tracking in the Ledge office, but I also had some meetings regarding my SAFER project. And so, kind of being able to run back and forth mentally between these two offices is an interesting challenge, but it's fun, I guess.
Great. Melody, you want to jump in on that?
Oh yeah, I was just going to echo that it's hard to tell what a typical day looks like from a fellowship, especially like the Merzion. The focus is really on your learning experience. So there's so much freedom to make it what you want and what you need to get out of it. So I, being super early in my PhD during my fellowship, I wasn't job hunting. I wasn't really looking to stay at the National Academies long term. So I spent a lot of time just at think tank events, meeting people in policy careers in DC and learning about their roles. And the time I did spend at the National Academies, I worked on writing internal proposals for future workshops. And then also I mentioned two big stakeholder workshops that happened while I was there. So all the staff on my board were like all hands on deck prepping for those. And so I helped a lot with like logistics, and I jumped on a lot of calls with stakeholders from across the country, just checking in on different projects, both like wrapping up previous reports as well as moving forward and planning future agendas.
Yeah, and I always hated when I was in SPG, the policy people who'd show up and they'd be like, every day is different. But I think that it also depends a lot on the role and the type of science policy work that you're doing. So when I was at EBRC, it was sort of a policy shop, almost think tanky like thing that focused on synthetic biology. And there were only 7 people within the organization. So the work there oftentimes was just need driven for the organization. So part of what I was working on was putting together a 100-page report about microbiome engineering research. But that was a report put together with contributions from academic researchers around the country. So we would have workshops on a regular basis to get information and just learn from them. So some period of my work would be organizing those workshops or cleaning up notes from the workshops, reading academic papers, and like trying to figure out how we could incorporate that into the report. But then at other times, I would have a week where I was basically just working on like making graphics for this report. So I spent a week in InDesign and Adobe Illustrator and learning how those programs work. But then where I'm at USAID now, it's more what I would describe as programmatic work in a way. So my office gets money from either Congress or a USAID mission, and then we give that money to what are called our implementing partners, who are the ones who actually run these programs. And what that means, especially if you have multiple different programs that you're helping manage, is that I need to meet with the implementing partners, and then there's also other meetings with the USAID missions, or basically the USAID part of the agency that is based in the country where we're actually doing work, because the way that USAID communicates with the missions is something that we want to kind of control and direct rather than having the implementing partner do it. And then at the same time, we need to communicate within the office or within other parts of the Washington-based bureau to make sure that everything that we're doing is kind of in line with both the office policies as well as the bureau goals, as well as whatever is coming down from the White House. So I jokingly describe my workday now as meetings to have conversations with people, and then sending emails about the meetings, and then having meetings to talk about the meetings that you already had. So there's a lot of meetings, a lot of email writing right now, and then not as much sort of heads down focused on science and technical things in the role that I'm in right now.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. A theme across all of these is a lot of meetings and a lot of emails. So I'd say for anyone looking to prepare, those are definitely ways to shore up. Stepping a little bit back towards the application process. I know a lot of folks who might be considering applying, who may be later stage graduate students or interested in applying, then resign at the end of this month or so. I'm curious to get some of your perspectives, particularly around the application process. So could each of you maybe talk a little bit more specifically about the application process for the Science Policy Fellowship you did, including some of the timelines, maybe some of the requirements, including interviewing, writing a policy memo, soliciting letters to recommendation. And in particular, was there anything that surprised you about the process that you would want to steer folks give folks advice for. Melody, I want to start with you for this one.
Sure. Yeah, so the Resign application this year is due on April 30th, so you still have time. The application consists of a statement that's pretty short. I believe it's around 500 words, and then 2 letters of recommendation. And a lot of the selection process just happens around your written application. And then if you're selected as essentially a finalist, then you'll do 1 phone call interview with the program director. And then after that, another phone interview with your potential mentor. So basically, each board or committee mentor picks kind of their own fellows and then, or their fellow or fellows, and then interviews them. I think in terms of advice, the most helpful thing I can say is to just emphasize involvement outside of the lab. And that doesn't have to be science policy specific. That could be outreach, volunteering, mentoring, civic engagement, whatever demonstrates that you care about the greater world outside your research, and that you're also able to be adaptable, learn quickly in new areas, and then also be a professional and represent the National Academies well. Because a lot of National Academies activities are outward facing. And I just mentioned a lot of the stakeholders I got to interact with. So I think just demonstrating that you're really eager to learn, you've already like built up certain experiences outside the lab, and you'll represent them well. It's really helpful. And then what surprised me is just after I was a fellow, just being shocked that everyone else did info interviews, and I completely missed the memo that that was a thing. So definitely encourage you to do info interviews. Resign alumni are very, very gracious about just having a quick phone call. And I'm happy to also have that phone call. It can really help just talk through your application thoughts, and also just give you a better idea of what the fellowship actually entails. I also put together a Google Doc capturing a lot of application advice from myself and then a couple other fellows. Because one thing I realized during the Resign is that a lot of these science policy fellowships, information gets disseminated through networks, of course, but sometimes those tend to be pretty insular networks. And so I'm kind of on a personal mission to try to get information outside those little circles. So definitely don't hesitate to cold call people or cold email people if they've had an experience you're interested in.
I guess I'll go next. And also, so with the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, I hesitate to go into too much depth because it's honestly a incredibly confusing and terrible process. One thing I think to really keep in mind, though, is that the congressional fellowship process is almost entirely different than the executive branch process. So I'll talk about the executive branch process and maybe, set up an alley-oop for Melody to finish on the congressional. But basically with the executive branch process, the application closes on November 1st, and you have to have your PhD completed at the time you submit your application. So that presents a challenge for a fair number of people, just how to make that work. I was lucky because my advisor was willing to work with me. So I filed in probably like October 22nd, then submitted my application and then continued working in the lab for another 2 months. But that's one thing to keep in mind, is that there's a hard deadline at the time of application. Then you have a semi-finalist interview in February-ish. It's a video interview with a panel of 8 scientists, usually some mixture of alumni or just other scientists in policy. And then after that, there's the finalist interview week, which is in this month, next week, April. And at that point, the finalists who are selected interview with all of the offices in the executive branch who are interested in taking a fellow. At the end of basically a week after finalist week, Then all of the offices give a ranked list of the people they interviewed, and the candidates give a ranked list of the offices that they're interested in. And then there's a sort of matching process to pair people up with ideally their highest match, to make sure that people are happy with their placement and that offices are happy with who they're getting. There are a lot of complications and details in that process that are too much to go into right now. But then in June, you typically get your final paperwork and start working in your office in September. So one of the things that I didn't realize was just how long that process would feel, because it's basically a year. Even if you only spend 2 months or a month getting your application together, it's a year from the time you start the application until you finish it. And there's not really any guarantee that you will have a fellowship position until about June when you sign your paperwork. And so living with this sort of limbo from November until June was just, and I was still working in a job that, I was going to be employed for until December of 2020 with my contract. But even then, there was just a really long time of not knowing what the next step was going to be. And that was one thing that kind of was surprising. And I didn't expect, of just like how annoying it would be to be in limbo for that long. So that's the executive branch. The congressional branch is not technically run by AAAS. It's really professional scientific societies who run the fellowships. And their applications are usually in December to January-ish. And then they have an interview process, and their fellows are selected, I want to say, in late March, early April. What was that, Melody? You're muted.
Depends on the society.
Okay, so it depends on the society. And then the congressional fellows don't actually get a placement. They get a guarantee of being a fellow, but don't get placed until orientation, which is in September. And so the fellows go through Nerd Prom, where all of the offices who are interested in a fellow, that's what they say it's called. They didn't, all the offices who are interested in getting a fellow that year meet with all of the fellows. And it's, I guess in regular times, it just happens in like a big ballroom, and it's sort of like speed dating. And then at that point, it's a sort of week of chaos, and then you get placed into an office, and then you start basically the next week, or yeah, pretty much the next week after you join the office. And the key detail with the congressional fellowships is that you don't need your PhD until you start. So with the executive branch, you need your PhD completed when you apply, but with the congressional branch, you only need to have your PhD once you start the fellowship. So there's about a 10-month gap. And I know that for a lot of people, if you're looking to transition from graduate school to a fellowship, that can have a pretty big impact on what you can or can't do. Anything else, Melody, that I'm missing?
Yeah. So I will mention that AAAS does sponsor 2 congressional fellows. And those 2 fellows are subject to you have to have your PhD in hand before you can apply. But the other 28-ish fellows are all funded through professional societies. And all the eligibility and the timelines and what the application actually entails is entirely determined by the professional society. So there are one of these societies I was looking at applying for, they actually had the requirement of you have to have your PhD by January. So I currently still don't have my PhD. I was not eligible for theirs. But you can really apply to as many societies that are vaguely even related to your area of work that you're eligible for. So I actually applied to 6. Applications were due in December and January for me. My first interview was at the beginning of February, and then I had basically a weekend, and then they accepted me. I accepted. So I've known since February that I would be a AAAS fellow in the congressional branch in September. But like Eric mentioned, I don't know whose office, like whether personal office, committee, House, Senate. I won't know that until September, and we go through that match process.
Yeah, and I will add that I, like many of the things that we've talked about today, definitely reach out to fellows if you're planning on, even if you're planning on applying, thinking about applying to any of those. I would say definitely, I'm always happy to chat about it, but the details of both the application process as well as for the executive branch, the matching process, and then the different experiences that fellows have between different agencies within the executive branch there are just so many nuances that I have had multiple like hour-long conversations with applicants just to sort of walk through the things that they need to keep in mind as they're going through that process. So I think don't trust that the website has all the information that you need to know. There's definitely a sort of, the process will be easier if you take the time to reach out to people or take the time to connect with someone who can connect you to all the people that you need to talk to.
Oh, that's a lot more complicated than CCST's process. So I'll just talk briefly about CCST's process. So the application usually opens up at the end, sometime in the beginning of December, and stays open for a few months. It closes in the beginning of March. And I think I've applied to various fellowships, and I felt like CCST's application was probably the most straightforward. But maybe I'm just biased. But anyhow, there's a first round of reviews that happens with the applications. If you're selected as a semifinalists, there is a first round of video conferencing interviews, which are only 15 minutes. And then after that process, if you're invited back as a finalist, you will be invited to their full interview, which was virtual last year and might still be virtual this year. It usually happens in the last week of May. This is approximately about a 30-minute interview. Before your interview, you do have a writing assignment that is just a policy memo assignment that you'll be required to complete prior to the interview. The interview includes both, it's both sort of a behavioral interview as well as the committee can ask you questions on your memo as well. It's about 13 to 15 people, I think, on that panel. So yeah, I think that was probably one of the most terrifying Zoom interviews I've ever done. And shortly after that interview, it's a very quick interview, and there's another short writing assignment that you must complete within about a 15-minute time frame immediately after that interview. And then afterwards, you have an opportunity to meet current and former fellows in the hospitality room, as they call it. And if you get accepted, you'll hear pretty quickly after the interviews, and then you have an opportunity to accept or decline at that point. I just want to touch a little bit about the placement aspect of this fellowship as opposed to the AAAS fellowship. Our fellowship goes through training before placements happen. And so we start training at the beginning. So our fellowship starts in the beginning of November. And it's actually kind of interesting compared to the other fellowships out there that tend to start maybe in the middle of the summer or kind of earlier in the fall. But our CCST starts in the beginning of November because elections happen in the beginning of November. And so that has a lot of ramifications and potential placements. So we start with training. It goes for about a month. There's a lot of information. It's like drinking out of a fire hose is the analogy a lot of people use. You learn a lot about California history, California politics. And actually for us, we were learning it sort of at real time because the elections were happening right as we started training. And then you get to learn a lot of activities, you get a taste of what work is like in a personal office within the legislature versus working in a committee, and touches a little bit about how some of the executive branch offices might operate. And so you kind of have this baseline knowledge of what a placement might look like before you go into the matching process. And so in the beginning of December, each fellow gets to meet with all of the offices that are looking for fellows. These are roughly 30-minute interviews. And at that point, you get to, the offices get to rank the fellows, you get to rank your fellows. And the rankings kind of require a lot of thought. CCST requires you to, kind of think through your goals, what you hope to achieve within that year. And then that sort of gets all, there's thrown into back room, maybe some black magic happens, and then they assign the placements, and we would start within our offices shortly thereafter. So happy to talk more about the placement process because it is rather a unique process.
Great, thanks to all of you for that. There's definitely kind of a lot of different things going on. I want to touch on one of the questions that also has come up in the chat, thinking about opportunities and kind of training opportunities during your fellowship experience. So framing this particular, if you already came in, I'm assuming a lot of you have come in with your specific policy interests, how much were you able to tailor whether it's your placement or kind of what the work you did or any training experience you had during your fellowship with those pre-existing interests? Eric, I see you thinking. If you want to hop on that first.
Sure. Yeah. I think it depends on how focused you are on a specific policy topic. So I am interested in infectious diseases and kind of health policy in general. But when I was going through the application process, I viewed my fellowship as an opportunity to sort of explore outside of my policy, like to explore around, get a breadth of experience with the assumption that I could, my fellowship placement wouldn't necessarily need to be a stepping stone to my next career move. I think that when you are interviewing or picking offices to interview as a AAAS executive branch fellow, you can narrow down where you're actually interviewing with to fit a specific policy interest, as long as there are positions that year that are open to you that fit your policy interests. I think that, to an extent, so basically that is to say to an extent you can, but it also could mean that in any given year, you might just not have that many options available to you. And I think that offices are sometimes more, depending on the agency, offices can be more or less willing to take on someone who really has very specific focus versus someone who, if their work changes or if the needs of the office changes, is willing to go and do that. So I think that it can vary and will oftentimes just depend on how you see the fellowship and what you're trying to get out of it.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Eric said. For me, my background was sort of more in the biomedical, biological research, biochemical research, and I had no background in environmental science. Yet I end up in environmental placement that is completely all about environmental science. But for me, I think one of the things I really wanted to, or a couple things. One thing I really wanted to just explore policy in general, and was willing to learn about whatever topic that came my way. And so having that open-mindedness is really important when going into a fellowship, because like Eric said, you might not have many options if you're so interested in one particular area. If I wanted to go into health policy, there are very few offices that were actually looking for, or very few offices that did health policy directly this year, but there are a lot of environmental science options available. And so having that flexibility and willing to learn a new area of science, I think, is very important. And that's something that I really did look forward to, was trying to get into a different field that I might have never have gone into had I not done fellowship.
Yeah, for me personally, I've stuck to healthcare broadly. For me, healthcare is just what motivates me. It's the reason I even picked bioengineering in the first place as well. But I say broadly because, for Mirzion, I did work with the National Cancer Policy Forum, and they were actually looking, I think, for fellows with some cancer research background. So that was closer to my research. However, of course, within cancer research, there's a huge range of topics. So it wasn't that close. However, I've also done a lot of work around vaccine advocacy that is unrelated to my research, just because that is such an important topic, even before COVID. And then, of course, during COVID now, the Texas Fellows are all working on vaccine advocacy. And then in Congress, I also hope to work on healthcare topics. But like the previous panelists have mentioned, I think it's really important to keep an open mind and not turn down good opportunities because they aren't in a narrowly defined area. I would be happy to work on drug pricing, or how healthcare is paid for, or even immigration policy, because there's so many intersections. I think Grant mentioned environmental issues and how those intersect with healthcare. So I think keeping an open mind there. I wouldn't recommend anyone necessarily commit to areas that you just don't have any interest in. But I think keeping an open mind, you'll see that so many policy issues are really, really connected. For Mirzion specifically, I'll say it's only 12 weeks. So don't get too picky about which board or committee you're with. Wherever you get placed, you'll have a great experience. And really the strength of that fellowship is just the network you'll gain and the experience of being at the national academies. And everyone, regardless of whether they get their top choice, board or committee or issue area, has a really good experience.
Great, thanks, y'all. Some great advice there. There's one particular question from the chat I want to highlight, and would caveat that this panel was very intentionally curated to be early career folks, many of whom are still in their fellowships. But one of the questions that hopefully some of y'all can speak to are, what are some of the pros and cons of completing a science policy fellowship, either in your early career or kind of versus some folks who do it maybe later in their career as well? Have any of y'all worked with folks who have done it later in their career, and maybe offer any insight on that?
Yeah, I'll say at least that there are a number of people in my cohort in the fellowship who are doing this as a mid-career sort of career change. I think that, if you wanted to work in science policy, I couldn't really see a benefit for intentionally going out of the way and staying in academia. I think that for a lot of the people who are doing this as a mid-career move, they were happy in academia for the 15, 20 years that they were doing that job and then decided to do something else. There are actually a number of people in my cohort as well who are currently on sabbatical from professorship positions. So that is another thing to point out, is that the STPF fellowship, as well as there's another fellowship called the Jefferson Science Fellows Program, that are both open to faculty. The Jefferson Science Fellows is actually only open to faculty. So there are other sort of mechanisms that exist to try to get people who are mid-career into policy, or to at least expose them to some of the policy world. But I mean, I think for me, it was just, I knew that I was interested in science policy, so I wanted to just get right into it. And I think a lot of the time, once you leave academia, people don't really understand what a postdoc even means. I think a lot of people see a postdoc as just extending your education from an already inconceivably long education that you do as a graduate student. So there's not necessarily any added value of doing a postdoc, especially if you're in more of the policy and programmatic oriented things versus maybe being a program officer at the NIH, where you're really working, like using technical expertise at a deep level on a daily basis. So that's been what I've observed so far in people in my cohort.
I would also add that to do a fellowship, think in mid-career, depending what your circumstances, let's say you're working in industry and decide you want to go into this fellowship mid-career, that might be a pay cut, and so that might be something you might want to think about, as well. So.
Yeah, I can't speak too much about details, but several of the congressional fellows in the current cohort are like later career people. And so that is something people do. They establish themselves in industry or academia, take sabbatical or leave, work in Congress, and then return to their normal job.
Great, thanks, y'all. There's an interesting question here in the chat that I want to get to as well. Specifically talking about, we talked a lot about other fellows and kind of interacting with other people in your cohort, but interacting with people who don't have a science background. So particular, how do you think your PhD kind of prepared you for a science policy career compared with other folks who maybe did, like an MPP or have other maybe more different background and coming to approach? So what are the differences in some of the types of works that you do, maybe in the same office, or kind of how you approach that?
So I will say one thing that's sort of unique in my placement is I work in a department that has a lot of PhDs. Actually, our director of our department has a PhD herself, and so I think. Chris had linked a blog post that I wrote for CCST earlier this year, and I write a little bit about this, is that, between the two offices that I work, one office is very technical. Safer Consumer Products has a lot of scientists, and so that sort of is a part of, I guess, my personality that kind of meshes with that culture, I guess, if you will. We kind of have monthly seminars about toxics from experts and something along those lines. So it's very reminiscent of academia in that respect. In the Ledge office, you're completely in a different world. And my mentor in the office is she has a PhD because she was a former or she's an alum of CCST as well, and so but that's the only other person I think that has a PhD in that office currently, and I think it's really interesting because the Ledge office really does interact with a lot of different individuals, staff. At the legislature, they may be straight out of college. You work with lobbyists who, represent a variety of different organizations. You work with engineers in different program areas, and I think it's a lot of fun getting to know a lot of people with different backgrounds, especially because coming from an academic background, you only know really that academic life, if you will, and being able to explore beyond that is really, really interesting and a lot of fun.
So for Merzion, you're not required to have a PhD or even be in a PhD program. Merzion's open to graduate degrees of all kinds, including medical degrees, law degrees. And so my cohort happened to be all PhD students or graduates, but that was an anomaly. And a lot of people at the National Academies don't have PhDs. Actually, most people on my board had a public health background. So I really enjoyed working with them. I wouldn't say our work was like shockingly different because I was in a PhD program and they had public health degrees. I think just my familiarity with cancer research did help with some like background context for some of the grant proposals, but really that's not something someone else who didn't have a cancer research background couldn't have learned. I think for me and just my experiences through Merzion and also just since Merzion and engaging with legislators and creating the Texas Science Policy Fellows Program, one thing I've learned is just how important it is to be humble about like a PhD isn't everything, STEM isn't everything. People who come from policy backgrounds have really important skills and knowledge that I don't. And so everything is a two-way street and I'm there to learn as much as I am to contribute. And I've seen that assuming that a PhD kind of like makes you really special can be a turnoff with engaging with some legislators who need to juggle a lot of considerations, including like politics and ideology and constituent needs. So just like my scientific background and my PhD training is just one part of the whole picture.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what Melody said. I think that the value or just the gap between a STEM PhD like what I have and people who work in my agency. So USAID is development oriented, and there are people who have master's degrees in development, or there's a guy in my office who has a PhD in development, and the skills and the knowledge that they bring is just really different. And I still constantly feel like I'm kind of trying to catch up on, pretty basic details about just what USAID does and the types of programs that it has. I don't know anything about childhood education. I know about infectious diseases, but knew very little about actual like bed net distribution programs that are the bread and butter of what USAID does overseas. And I think that, so for one of the programs that I'm involved with, we provide funding to academic researchers in developing countries where USAID is working. So there's a certain amount of our work that is really us interfacing with scientists and academics. But at the same time, all of that work is happening within the broader political and policy goals of USAID, as well as all of the kind of relationships and management that needs to happen between us and the agency or our implementing partners. And while I can bring something to the table for the conversations that we have with those scientists, of being able to really kind of talk at the same level of academic research, there are so many other parts of the work that people from non-scientific backgrounds bring that make it all work together.
Great, thanks, y'all. The next question that I have personally is a bit niche, but specifically thinking about, for some of y'all had to write policy memos as part of your application, but also there's the process of, I'm sure many of y'all have written different policy memos, one-pagers, briefing documents as part of your fellowship. And I think for a lot of folks who are involved in early career science policy and maybe have submitted to something, for example, the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, if I know Grant sits on the editorial board, a lot of our training is around advocacy. And specifically, to what extent is some of the writing you did or the work you did is particularly advocating for particular issues or particular positions, or to more inform your member or the office that you're working for? If any of y'all want to speak to that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
So I will say advocacy is not what we do. In the Ledge office, when we write our bill analyses, it is more of an exercise of communicating information to inform a decision. Well, I guess I will say that part of that process, there is a portion where you can include, I guess, support or oppose positions, I guess, but depending on the subject, it can vary significantly. I think one of the interesting things I would say for me, as the Ledge office, we work to provide our director, which eventually will provide information to our agency head. We're trying to compile information from various areas, from program, from the legislature, kind of weighing the various aspects of what program needs or desires versus what's politically feasible. There is a little bit of juggling that we have to do, and that's what what your mentors are there for, is to kind of help you understand that landscape, because it's not very easy to understand, especially if you're brand new. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a great question, Chris, because one of the things I really learned a lot about when I was at the National Academies is how different organizations have very different roles in the advocacy, policy, politics space. And so a lot of what we do as early career people in science policy, we do a lot of advocacy. I support vaccination. I support equitable vaccination. I think all my legislators should do the same. But that's very different than like what the National Academies does. So the National Academies really functions as a convener of stakeholders. So they'll bring together experts who will then like discuss various topics, and some of their activities involve the experts making consensus recommendations, which then turn into really powerful reports because they kind of carry the weight of this very distinguished panel. And other National Academies activities just turn into basically proceedings where it's just reported each individual's personal view on that issue. But overall, I would say the National Academies is very much not an advocacy organization. However, there's other organizations like Union of Concerned Scientists that do a lot more active advocacy. So I think a fellowship is actually a really good way. I'll plug the Zion, of course, to spend time in the DC science policy space and understand the different distinct roles that these different organizations play. And also figure out like what makes the most sense for you and what you like doing, where you want to end up. So like the National Academies is super, super nonpartisan. And I mentioned my political organizing background. So I had an idea that I probably didn't want to work there long term. And that led me to focus on the congressional opportunity.
Yeah, I think from the places that I've experienced, it also is the difference between advocacy and writing to inform people is pretty significantly different in when you were operating within the federal government. I know that for us, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that the executive branch can't advocate to legislators for funding. There are specific rules that say that we can't ask Congress for money. Any asking or advocating for funding has to basically come through the White House before it goes from, and so you can advocate to the people higher up in your agency who are also then advocating to the White House, and hopefully they'll include that in the White House budget request, but you are not allowed to essentially do a runaround on the White House and go to a representative and say, give us some money. But to kind of counter to that, though, we do have some ability to do like Hill briefings where we can pick representatives and just tell them the nice things that we've done and how this program has benefited their constituents in the district. But at the same time, there's no ask. It's very much a just, isn't it nice that we did this thing, and then leave. But then I think when I was at EBRC, there's a different element of advocating for a specific topic or specific change, like programs. So I think at EBRC, we had the benefit of being further away from the policy work that's related to synthetic biology. And I think when you're in the government, there are so many sort of distinct silos of how things work that information transfer between agencies is nearly non-existent, because most information transfer between agencies needs to go through an interagency panel, and it just takes a lot for anything to happen there. So a lot of the times what we kind of had the role of is that we would talk to everyone that we knew in all the different agencies, compile it into something, and then go to different agencies and say, hey, pay attention to these things. This is what's important. You know, these are the things that are happening within the federal government that you should know about. And so there are, I think, depending on your role within the government, there are different ways that it is kind of advocacy, kind of informing. But I think from within the government, especially the executive branch, it maybe leans more towards the informing, just because of the nature of the relationship between any individual office and how money comes through.
Great, thanks for that. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and amalgamate a couple audience questions into this next one, specifically asking about how you think about your fellowships in the context of your next step career-wise, and maybe some of y'all can also speak to things that people in your programs have gone on to do, the types of positions they take. I'm going to specifically also want to tag into that, what are some of the unique opportunities that you maybe took advantage of or hope to take advantage of in your fellowship that you don't think you couldn't have gotten through any other type of avenue into science policy? So I'll give y'all a second to think about that, and anyone who wants to jump in, feel free to go.
Okay, I will say that the network is the most incredible part of my Merzion experience, and I expect the same will be true for AAAS. I did my Merzion kind of early in my PhD, but a lot of the other fellows were later on about to defend or had already defended. So they were going through the DC job hunt, or outside DC too, science policy job hunt process while we were fellows. So several of them ended up being AAAS exec fellows, several ended up being AAAS congressional fellows, and we all stayed in touch. And so when I got ready to do my congressional fellowship application process, I had that network to draw from. And so that was just incredibly helpful for me to have a preview of what was coming essentially 2 years before I was about to do it. And then I think for congressional, also Merzion, just like having had that experience and like being effective in DC, I think made me a much stronger candidate for the congressional selection process. Because it just proved that I knew how to function outside of the lab. I would represent my society really well. I was ready to like hit the ground running. I had done it before I could do it again. I really hope to network my congressional fellowship into a real job in Congress. I think fellowships are really great in getting your foot in the door. And so one challenging thing about Hill jobs is there are a ton of people who want to work on the Hill, not a ton of funding, not a lot of positions. So a lot of people end up doing either unpaid or underpaid internships. And that's just not financially feasible for me, and probably not feasible for a lot of y'all as well. So the congressional really offers you an opportunity to be compensated pretty well as far as government jobs goes, and then get that experience, start building that network, and then use that year of experience to get yourself into your next step, whether it's in Congress or somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, my vigorous head nodding, if it didn't tell you already, the network for AAAS, I think is a really nice thing that I don't think would be possible. People colloquially refer to the AAAS network as the Fellows Mafia or the AAAS Mafia, just because there's 130 to 150, I think, fellows who join the fellowship each year. And at least a third, if not a half of those people will stay within the DC Science Policy Network. So just any time, like I have found multiple times of just any, I'm interested in a position or interested in talking with someone at an office, there's going to be a AAAS fellow or a fellow who knows someone there and they can put you in touch. And it has been helpful. Like I decided to apply for a job on USA Jobs, the government like hiring website, and the amount of knowledge of just, we have a WhatsApp thread with 200 fellows and just blast a message out and like, hey guys, I need help. And then even with the Biden transition team, when he released that, I think probably at least 6 or 7 people on the team were AAAS fellowship alumni. And so it really is nice. It's a really big perk of being part of the fellowship, is gaining access to that network of people who are early career like you to all the way, political appointees at the White House level who have all done this fellowship, and are oftentimes, even for as high up as they go, if they can fit you on their calendar, are oftentimes happy to talk with you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think with the CCST Fellowship, we're a smaller alumni network, but still a very strong alumni network and a very close-knit alumni network. And a lot of alumni do stay in state service, whether within the legislative branch or within the executive branch, or may end up going to work for advocacy organizations or many jobs within that interface between science and policy. And I think for me personally, I think going through the experience so far, my personal interest would be to be able to continue working within, well, it'd be nice to work at DTSC, but within Cal EPA would be a nice opportunity for me. And I think the other thing is, getting a government job is sometimes not very easy to understand. USA Jobs is very complicated if you don't know what you're doing. California has a very, strange employment system as well. It has this weird, exam assessment thing that no one quite understands what it is. And so, being able to tap into that network, not only through the fellowship, but also, the people you work with within the executive branch, it can really help you figure out how to work through that application process. I will also note that CCSD does give a lot of support to fellows in terms of professional development. They have contracts out to career advisors from UCSF, and they do coaching sessions, helps you clarify what your goals might be, what you might be interested in, and kind of works with you throughout that process as well. So, yeah. Oh, and also I would also add the program does a very tries to do a very good job with mentorship and pairing every fellow with a mentor that they will be able to work well with. That's sort of part of that black magic that they do in the matching process. They really try to match personalities as much as they try to match interest as well. So that's one thing.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all of you. This has been a great session and we're just about out of time, but I want to echo what kind of on that last point that a lot of our panelists spoke about, and the importance of the network. I would say that there's 3 great folks here on this call right now who could be a great first step into getting into your network in science policy. So I'd encourage all of y'all to continue to engage with that, and particularly if you're at Berkeley. I know there was a question earlier on the science policy group at Berkeley is a great place to start your network and get involved with, or whatever affiliate institution you might have, or the National Science Policy Network as well. With that, we're just about out of time, but I hope y'all join me in a virtual round of applause for all of our panelists. And thank you for joining us today. And we hope to see all of y'all again soon in the future. And thanks for coming.